Hey guys, welcome to our third episode of Square One Basics. We've talked about composition, we've talked about shutter speed. This time we're going to be talking about ISO and aperture. But first, we're going to talk about ISO. ISO is just how your camera digitally enhances your image. It brightens it up after you take it. So it has nothing to do with how much light you allow into your camera, but what it does is it takes whatever photo you take and it enhances it, it brightens it up. So you have different settings on your ISO. You have 100, 200, 400, 800, and it doubles up every single time. And some cameras can go up super high. Mine goes up to 12,800, something like that. And the higher quality your camera is, the better it'll work for you. So there's a disadvantage to just relying on your ISO to enhance your image. The problem with ISO is the higher the rating, the more grainy it gets. And so higher quality cameras can go at a higher rating without get that kind of grainy look, or we also call it noise. That's another word for it. So when it comes to making your purchase, you've got to think about, are you going to be shooting a lot in dark settings? For example, are you doing wedding photography? Because if you are, you're probably going to end up in a lot of darker venues. And having a good camera that can shoot great ISO ratings, that can be pretty important. But keep in mind, those cameras are going to be a lot more expensive. In the old days, when they used film and didn't have sensors, they actually had different types of film strips that had different ISO ratings on them. And so if you were shooting in a darker setting and you wanted a higher ISO, you would have to switch out your film and put in a different film that had a higher ISO. But today all we have to do is just press a button and you can change your ISO rating right there in your camera. The aperture on your camera is very similar to your eyeball. Have you ever seen someone walk from a dark room to a light room and their pupils get smaller? Or vice versa, they walk from a light room to a dark room and their pupils get bigger? It's the same concept. So what happens is your pupils get bigger in dark settings so you can gather more light and you can see better. And then in light settings, they get smaller so you don't get super blinded. So with your aperture on your camera or in your lens, it changes the amount of light that's let in by that. Now don't confuse this with shutter speed. Your shutter is going to open and close every time you take a picture. So when your shutter is opening, no matter how fast it's opening and closing or how slow, your aperture is going to stay the same depending on what you set it at. So when you're in a darker setting, we talked about having a slower shutter, but you can also change your aperture so it opens up more and gathers more light. And then on the flip side, if it's darker setting, you want to close up your aperture. Now here's the part that gets really confusing to everybody, so just take it a little bit at a time. Your aperture, which is also known as f-stop, is rated by a number. Every lens can open up to a different aperture. Now typically, the larger that hole can get, the more expensive that lens is going to be. The smaller the number, the bigger the aperture. The bigger the number, the smaller the aperture. There's an entire equation that goes along with your aperture, but we're not going to talk about that because it's really confusing and I don't like math. Every lens is measured by two things. One, the millimeter length of that lens, and two, its aperture rating, or how big that hole can get. Smaller the number, typically the more expensive the lens is going to be. So this lens that I have on my camera right now can go between a 2.8 and 22. So once again, 22 means it's going to have a super small hole, and then a 2.8 means it's going to get a lot bigger. Now my 50 millimeter lens is a lot shorter and it goes to a 1.4, no, it's 1.8. A lot of the other ones can go down to a 1.4. Now that means it can let in a lot more light than this camera. This being just a 2.8, my other lens being a 1.8. So I can use that in darker settings without having to raise my ISO and slow down my shutter. Before you decide to open up your aperture a whole bunch to let in all that light, you've got to realize what else it's going to do to your camera. When you look at really professional photos, there are a lot of things that make it look nice and clean. And one of those things is that blurry background. It's also called bokeh. I don't even know where the origin of that word is from, but it's a cool word. Now bokeh is reference to that subject being in focus and everything else behind it being blurred out. Like I said, that larger aperture or smaller number is going to give you more light, but what it's also going to do is affect where that blur is. If you shrink down that hole a whole bunch, so you go to a bigger number, then you're going to be able to see a lot farther. So this is called depth of field. Okay, now like I said, aperture gets a little confusing. So the best way that I've figured out to kind of see what I'm talking about here is think about a hose. When a hose has a large exit, the water just kind of falls out typically. As the exit gets smaller, it builds up pressure and it goes farther. So when you think about your bokeh or your depth of field, when it's bigger, so a smaller number, your aperture, bigger hole, think about that water just kind of falling out. so you see things closer, but everything else behind it is blurred. But when it gets smaller, bigger number, smaller hole, the hose starts to build pressure and shoot out farther, just like how your camera will now see farther. Bigger hole, shallow depth of field, smaller hole, deeper depth of field. Now hopefully that kind of makes sense. Your subject doesn't always have to be in the foreground, it can be in the background too. You can have something in front of you that's blurred out and focused on the thing behind you. Now that's just how you decide where to focus your camera in on. Now in photography, aperture is measured in speed. So a bigger hole or pupil or whatever you want to call it means it's a faster f-stop or faster aperture. If it gets smaller, means it's slower. So going back to my lens, since my lens can go down to 2.8, it's a fairly fast lens. Some lenses, typically telephoto lenses that can see farther, they can't go as low, so therefore they're slower lenses. Now, just like your shutter with that TV setting we talked about last time, you can change your aperture priority. So now you can switch it to AV on a Canon, and I think it's just A on a Nikon, and you can now mess around with your aperture or your f-stop, and you can play around with that and get used to it, and your camera will adjust all the other settings to compensate for it. So just to review, ISO is how you enhance your image digitally inside your camera. And remember, if a number goes up too high, it's going to get a lot more grainy and you lose quality in your image. And aperture is going to affect the two things, your light and your depth of field. So it's going to affect light, meaning the bigger the hole, the more light it's going to let in. Remember, the bigger hole means smaller number. Smaller hole means bigger number. And as far as your depth of field goes, the larger that hole is, the more shallow it's going to be. It's going to be blurry in the background. Your foreground is going to be a lot more in focus. Everything else is going to be blurred behind it. And then that bigger number or the smaller hole, you're going to be able to see farther. It takes away all of that blur. So that's good for landscapes and such, so you can see everything. For portraits, you want a faster aperture, so a bigger hole, because then you'll get that cool blur in the background. You'll be able to focus on just your subject, and it kind of makes them pop out a little bit more. So take some time to practice your aperture settings and see how it affects your photos. For updates on new videos, remember to follow me on Facebook and Twitter at Square One Basics. See you guys.